Well, hello and welcome. My name is Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education, and I'm so excited to welcome you today to our session called the Acceleration Imperative, focusing on student learning. So this is the first in a series that we're planning to do on education in the post-COVID era. I have my second vaccination shot tomorrow morning, and so I'm very excited to be moving into this future era. My kids are 2 weeks back in full-time school, and I'm also excited about that. So we have this session. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of our upcoming sessions related to this and other topics at the end. But with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mike Petrilli of the Fordham Institute to get us going and introduce the remainder of the panelists. Thanks, Mike.
Great. Thank you so much, Celine. Hello, everybody. I really appreciate Celine and her team at GFE hosting this session. We are proud members of GFE ourselves and look forward to seeing everybody in person, perhaps for a conference soon. As Celine says, things are finally starting to look a little bit brighter at the end of this very dark year that we've all been through. And I am super excited to be moderating this panel. Why don't we go ahead to the next slide so you can see everybody's names and titles. We have a great panel here to kick off this series to really focus in on what school districts, charter school networks, schools can do to help kids recover from this very difficult year when we're hoping all kids or almost all kids will be back in class in the fall and the recovery phase of this crisis can begin in earnest. So to talk about that with us today, we've got a great lineup. You see again their names and titles. Mary Alice is the Deputy Director, K-12 Education at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Brian is a doctoral candidate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, used to be basically the CAO at DC Public Schools, and is now actually in Chicago, where he is teaming up with Chicago Public Schools as well. Gene Pinkard, the Assistant Director of Practice and Leadership at Aspen, and he too was in DC Public Schools not so long ago, leading up many of their reform efforts. And then Celine and Grantmakers for Education. So we're going to really talk about all kinds of things today about what schools and districts can do to help kids recover. And most importantly for this audience, what funders can do to support those efforts. We all know that there's a ton of federal money that is coming down the pike, especially to large urban districts and charter networks. That is good news because we know those resources are needed to help these schools meet the needs, the huge needs of so many kids. And so maybe it feels like your grants are just a pittance compared to this federal money that's coming, but not so, right? Because we know in situations like this, there's a lot that funders can do as thought partners, as well as funders to help districts and charter networks and others make good decisions about how to spend this money, whether that means helping them do some planning, doing strategic planning, looking for best practices, convenings, reaching out to the community, and much else. And so we'll dig into all of that as well. So again, both the substance of what schools can be doing to help kids during this time and the substance of what funders can be doing to help those schools and districts and networks. With that, let me tell you a little bit about a new resource from the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, where I am president, that many of all the folks on this panel helped us put together. Let's look at the next slide, please, if we can. And that is something that we call the Acceleration Imperative. And you know that from the title of this event. What this is a crowdsourced recovery plan, really built with school districts and charter networks in mind. This particular one is focused on elementary schools. And it is comprehensive. I'm not sure on your screen if you can see, it's kind of small, but that table of contents gives you just a sense of one of the main arguments of this document, which is that at this time, of course, we should be talking about tutoring. We should be talking about expanded mental health supports. We're going to get into all of that today. But this is also an opportunity for everybody to focus also on the core programs of schools and districts and networks. And with the federal resources, this is a great time, for example, to purchase high quality curriculum, if that's something that a district has not done yet. Curriculum that gets all greens from Ed Reports, that is aligned with the standards that they're using in the state, that is engaging, culturally relevant, and on and on. this is a good time for that, because if you're going to, for example, provide tutoring, you got to decide what curriculum you're going to use for that tutoring. And a lot of the research shows, ideally, you need to have a curriculum that is the same curriculum that you're using in tutoring that you're using during the regular school day. And ideally, that would be a high quality curriculum. So, adopting that curriculum, that's a good use of the funds, as is implementing a curriculum by hiring an organization that really knows a lot about that particular curriculum and how to help teachers get comfortable with it, teach it effectively, and really deepen their knowledge. So, those are the sorts of things in this plan. That's why it runs over 120 pages long. It is really a comprehensive look at what elementary schools in particular can do to help kids to address their academic needs, to address their social and emotional needs, some of the mental health crises that we know that are happening out there, and really gets into school culture, gets into instruction, and so much else. It is crowdsourced. And what that means is we had an early draft. We shared it with chief academic officers, current and former, in big districts and charter networks, with academics at universities, with other experts, including the folks on this panel. Got a ton of feedback, over 1,000 comments. And this version of the plan represents that. But we are also hoping that this plan evolves with the feedback from the field. And so we've put it on a wiki. Next slide, please, if we can look at that. So when you go, it's actually hosted on a site called CAO Central for chief academic officers, because we think that probably is the target audience, the main folks who are thinking about the recovery plans for their districts. And then next slide, please. And the way that it works, it's like Wikipedia. You can go on here, you can request editing rights, you can edit right on the site, you can make comments. Again, the notion here is that it is evidence-based. That's the perspective we started from, but also meant to be informed from real life experience on the ground, and to try to get practitioners engaged in helping each other do some of this planning. Again, we know we've got this school system with 14,000 school districts, so fragmented. We don't need every one of those districts or every one of our 7,000 charter schools to be going off alone and trying to figure this out by themselves. Maybe this is something that we can do jointly, and that's the notion there. Okay, next slide. And you'll see it's really actually kind of fun that you can go in, and there's a bunch of comments in here already from our initial reviewers, and now increasingly from practitioners. And you feel like you're sitting in a room with some super smart people like Doug Lemov, talking about instructional practice and talking about curriculum and talking about school culture and talking about what do we do to meet the particular needs of kids in this moment in time. So I hope you'll check it out and contribute to it and help us make it better. And all right, so we can go now to the panel. We can put the PowerPoint aside for now, and let's bring up our panel and get started. So once again, for folks who might have joined a little bit late, we're going to talk both about what schools and districts and networks can be doing at this time to make sure that we address the academic, social, emotional needs, mental health needs of kids, and what funders can do to help those schools and networks and districts do that work. And especially in light of all the federal resources, how maybe small investments from grant makers, from private grant makers, can make a big difference right now. So let's get started. I'm going to start with Brian. Brian, from your time in DC and your perch there in Chicago, curious, as I just said, the acceleration imperative makes this argument that we shouldn't just be looking at tutoring or extras like mental health supports, maybe that are on top of what schools usually do, that we also, this is a moment to focus on schools' core issues, including curriculum, something that you worked on a lot in DC public schools. Tell us why is curriculum so important at this moment in time?
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Celine and GFE, for having me here today. I'm excited to share some thoughts around the important work that Fordham did with the acceleration imperative, and from my own experience in district leadership and in the classroom. So I am quite bullish from my own experience and the research on the importance of investing in a strong core curriculum as a major lever for instructional improvement. A 2018 national study showed that grade level assignments were only observed during that study in 26% of the time in the classroom. So of grade level assignments, you're only seeing them in about a quarter of classrooms at any given time. And from my viewpoint, there are very few things that you can do at scale that penetrate into the instructional core. the interaction between teachers and students in the presence of content. And at the center of that core is the task. It is what students are asked to do. What do they spend their time doing in the classroom? And in my experience, nothing gets to that task better in a day-to-day manner than the core curriculum and high quality instruction materials the teacher uses to decide what to teach, how to teach it, and when to teach it. So I see a really powerful investment in curriculum first, and then. So some students will need the core and more, but all students need the core. I'll say second, I believe a big investment in the curriculum is important because it allows you to build what I like to call instructionally enabling systems around the curriculum. You have all your teachers, your second grade teachers now can collaborate around similar materials and lessons, upcoming lessons. You can structure your family engagement around things that students are actually doing in the classroom. And something we had lots of success in DC doing is you can then finally have an entry point for community partners to get much more involved in the academic learning of students. So fourth graders in DC learn about rocks and minerals. And until we adopted that unit in the fourth grade, we didn't have a place to partner with places like the Smithsonian's museum. But now all fourth graders go to the rocks and minerals lab at the Smithsonian as part of that core instructional unit. So if I were to kind of think through some, my advice to funders that are on the call, local or national, it'd be number one, you can find ways to support your local districts or CMOs in adopting high quality instruction materials. That could be the purchase of the materials themselves. It could be the teacher development time to allow teachers to collaborate around those materials. It could be the family engagement and the community engagement. I will also note finally, that if you are considering, as you mentioned, investments in things like high dose tutoring or other student supports, to ask yourselves and ask district partners, how are those supports directly connected to the core curriculum of the district as an entry point to your funding?
Really well said, Brian. And sometimes when I listen to the conversation about curriculum, I bet a lot of people out there just assume like, well, of course, it seems so obvious. Of course, we need a curriculum, right? And yet all the national data indicates that still, more than 10 years after the Common Core were adopted, that teachers still report that they do not have standards aligned curriculum. A majority of teachers will say that. They're still going to sites like Teachers Pay Teachers to download stuff, often on their own dime. We did a study at Fordham finding the most popular materials on that site, and a few of the other popular ones were not very good. And so I guess the question that funders might just ask is trying to figure out, do the districts and CMOs, charter management organizations they work with, do they actually have high quality curriculum or not? So, Brian, how do you ask that question? Is it well, does your curriculum get all greens at edreports.org, or what are you looking for?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's two steps to that. First is asking the question, have you adopted any materials at all? Do you have a core curriculum that helps teachers decide what to teach, how to teach it, and when to teach it? I was just on a call with a number of chief academic officers and superintendents from the New England states last week, and they were reporting that upwards of 80% of their central academic budget goes towards interventions and student services and supports, not the core curriculum. And that is a signal that there's lots of space for shifting some of that budgeting into core curriculum. Your second, so that's just one, are you doing it? Two, then of course is the important question around, is it high quality? Is it aligned to standards? Is it relevant? Is it rigorous? Is it engaging even? And there are available resources now online. EdReports is the most notable one. They rank across a rubric, and we often hear EdReports green curriculum. Some states have done some of that work. Louisiana, most notably, has done rigorous reviews of not just curriculum, but also assessments and PD providers. And then finally, in DC, we often pulled our own teachers and together and piloted a different curricula before adopting them at scale. There's a tremendous amount of work to make sure that curriculum is not only culturally relevant in general, but very much specific to your district. Are students seeing themselves and their backgrounds in that curriculum? And it's providing windows to other worlds.
That's Great. I would add too that a new group that has popped up called Rivet Education that is kind of
Yes.
like the ed reports for professional development providers. So, to vet the organizations that contract with districts and CMOs to provide the support to help teachers implement curriculum and learn other skills, and that they've tried to identify the ones out there that are doing well. Also interesting to note, and I'll be curious maybe later, Celine, if you see this too, is that the conversation, it feels like in the funding world and the policy world, it has shifted. Wasn't that long ago, 5 years ago, we were mostly talking about, teacher effectiveness and evaluating teachers and holding teachers accountable. Now it seems like it's much more about providing tools for teachers. This notion that, hey, how can we help all teachers get better? And in part, that's by providing them the most important tools of the job, which is curriculum, right? I mean, there's other tools, technology, but the curriculum is the core one. So an interesting shift, and it seems like say the same, Celine, you see that as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think there's a outside of the classroom to, more kind of social and emotional level supports. But yes, certainly, how do all teachers get better, I think, is a central question, and curriculum is a central solution or strategy.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was a good segue, Celine, not even planned, to my next question. This one's for Jean, and it's on the question around social and emotional learning. So, there's been a ton of talk, some evidence about just the terrible mental health crises that so many of our young people are going through out there. Of course, the teachers are going through. People have lost family members. Of course, communities of color in particular have been hit hard. And this is on top of, everything that's gone on in our world around racial injustice. And, so kids finally come back this fall and people want to help them make the transition. How do you think about this, Jean? What should schools and districts be doing to help young people? And is it a matter of mostly of, having more counselors and the like, or what? What do we need to be doing?
You would think I would know not to mute myself. As soon as I get vaccinated and back in the office, I'll remember to unmute myself.
Yes, we all will. Yes.
So there's a few themes here that I think are congruent to some of what Brian was saying. So when we're doing this well, it's not just about crisis response and trauma response, right? It's not just about 80% on intervention. It's about how do we integrate this into the core curriculum? How do we integrate this into our core culture and practices? So we think of it as a three-legged stool. You've got your explicit instruction on SEL and on those competencies, but you're also thinking about how it's integrated into how we teach and how we interact. And it's a core tenet of the culture and climate that we're constructing. We're not going to get the academic acceleration that we hope to get, whether it's from ESSER dollars or high quality instructional materials or professional development, if we're not acting in accordance with what the research tells us, that relationships matter, climate, stress. These are drivers for achievement, or they decelerate achievement. So when this is done well, there's a couple of ways that I might illustrate this. So in the places where I've been a school leader at an alternative high school, at a dual language elementary school, we made every effort that we could to staff accordingly, so that the mental health staff could have attention to a caseload of students who needed acute attention, but also had scheduling and space in their time to push into the classroom with the core content teacher, where they might do a lesson on what kind of tools you use to have a civil disagreement in the classroom so that you can more effectively debate content. What does it mean to have empathy, both as a human person in your interactions with your peers, but imagine how powerful that is as a tool for engaging with literature as well. And so we're building all of this into that interaction where the mental health staff are with the students, all of the students, with the faculty as a whole. And then when they leave the room, that toolkit of mindfulness routines, that understanding of empathy, that doesn't leave the classroom when they leave the classroom. It becomes part of our culture and climate. At the systemic level, it means that systems are giving equal weight and attention to data that help us understand this. When I was in DCPS, we restructured the data dashboard that school leaders would utilize so that they could have the same level of insight, disaggregating longitudinal trends, correlation trends for social emotional data, for climate data, as they would for academic data. That's what it means to integrate all of this together. Right now, as it pertains to ESSER funds, yes, there are some investments that we might want to make. We know that needs are more acute, that we have just some fact finding to do. There are literally students that systems have lost track of during the pandemic. And so, yes, we need more robust investments on the front end to help do that. But as that funding subsides, what we know is that these are not just, as I said, trauma needs, these are human needs. And so they have to be part of our standard operating procedures. The last thing I'll say on this at this moment is that we need to think about what this means for how students bring their whole selves and how faculty members bring their whole selves into the classroom. That's particularly pertinent when we talk about the racial reckoning that has really been highlighted in 2020. And I would suggest that there's a political reckoning, neither of which are resolved right now. And if we're asking students to live with empathy, or as one of the things that we highlighted, or that's highlighted in the acceleration initiative, is the notion of standing up for what's right. And then we teach slavery, or we teach beloved, or we look at what happened on January 6th. This is heavy stuff for everyone. And so if we're not thinking and this is where, like Brian hit the nail on the head, if you have a rich curriculum with meaningful tasks, it creates this localized learning experience where it matters for what we're doing right here, where we're studying photosynthesis and we're thinking about why are there green spaces in one neighborhood and not in another neighborhood. And so one of the things when we released a guide on how school leadership teams can integrate social, emotional, and academic development, this isn't colorblind. It's not neutral. It's not a universal lesson. It's highly localized. It requires engagement and a deep understanding of the culture and people that with whom we're interacting. So there's no perfect answer to all of this. It does stretch resources. It does require a lot of adults. There's no single right answer, but I can assure you that do nothing or not paying attention to this is the wrong answer.
Yeah, really well said, Gene. It is heavy. It's hard. I mean, this sounds really hard. And when you talk about school culture, I mean, I like the idea of collecting data and making sure you have systems, and I'm sure local funders could help pay for some of that, surveys and things. But is it fair to say that at the end of the day, that the culture, it's going to be largely about the school principal? And so that's a big piece as well, is just figuring out, do we have a real strategy to make sure we've got the very best people leading these schools?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And what the research tells us is that one of the primary ways, if not the primary way, that a principal can drive achievement is through his or her attention to climate and culture. And climate and culture are distinct, but I'll blur that line a little bit for the moment, in the sense that the principal is giving attention to the vision of and sending the signals of how that vision is manifest in what we do. And then asking the questions about climate, how people are experiencing what we're doing here, whether it's on the cultural side or the instructional side. The only thing I would sort of amend to your question, Michael, is that, how do I say this? A great leader understands that it's not just about them, right? This is the place in which, if you have that climate data and you've done the survey and you see where your students, how they've responded, that's actually the beginning of the conversation. That's the information you need to ask the follow-up question to bring students and parents and the community to the table, so that the principal's real role is to create the space where the community creates a healthy culture, where everybody is invested in a climate that is engaging, where people feel a sense of belonging, so that they have the security to dive into those rigorous tasks and to meet with struggle and failure sometimes and push through to the other side where it's meaningful for them and they're learning a lot.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. And it makes me wonder, again, in funder world, we know that Wallace has done amazing work on leadership over the years, and they've been really focused in on pipelines recently. We know there's a ton of funders out there really interested in social and emotional learning and in school climate and school culture. And And I wonder if there's, how do we make those two worlds maybe come together? Because it does seem like there's a lot of potential to make those fit. All right, so much more to talk about, but let's go to Mary Alice. Mary Alice, you've had a lot of cool jobs in your career. We were talking about before the session, including superintendent of a suburban district outside Seattle, and then policy work for Governor Inslee. And now at the Gates Foundation, you got picked to have a really cool job, which was to be the point person on all things related to this COVID crisis in K-12 education. And so I'm just really curious for the funders, other funders here, what have you learned over the last year that helps you think through what funders can do to be helpful to schools and to districts and to networks as we go forward?
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to GFE for having me. It's really an honor. What really resonated with what both Brian and Jean have been talking about is there is not one answer. It is a system, just like it's not just about the principal, it's about everyone's role and the importance of how individuals, including students, especially students, and their families contribute to the whole. Like, we often want a silver bullet. If we just invest in this, it'll change the world. Well, we know that's not the case. So even if you have Curriculum Green and you have the best mathematic resource, if you don't have instructional strategies and support for using that material in a way that can impact student success, it doesn't matter. And so you can reverse that too. You can be the best teacher and have the instructional strategies. And if you don't have the right materials to standards and high expectation, your kids are not going to get to the level of success that we know they can achieve. And so when we talk about social emotional learning, when we talk about the pandemic, when we talk about one of the things that has surfaced since I took on COVID recovery is trying to recognize that it all happens at the local level, right? So whether you're a funder that's going to support one school or one thing, you may have a particular interest in SEL, you might have a particular interest in accelerating math, you might have a particular interest in leadership that was highlighted. It all matters. So the good news for the role of philanthropy is that no matter what the particular area, it will contribute, as long as you realize it's contributing one part to a whole system. And what we're trying to do with the COVID recovery effort, particularly with philanthropy, is to say, okay, what are the key components of knowledge that we need to mobilize to ensure that the folks making decisions about the stimulus dollars have the best information in their hands? We don't have all the answers. Locally, you have the answers, but what information do we have that we have a responsibility? And again, the role of philanthropy versus the role of a superintendent or a principal or a parent in a community or a community funded effort. We're trying to collaborate across funders on a large scale to say, what can we do with executive sponsorship to create a coalition of the alphabet soup of organizations, education organizations, to say, here's what we know, here's the knowledge that we believe should and could be advanced. Here's what it's based on. So it's not just somebody's thought. Here's the research behind it. Here's Ed Reports as an example. Here's the Curriculum Green. Here's how they analyze it. And, use this information as you're thinking about this component. So we've put together a 10-point plan that really is just designed around the appropriate or allowable use of the stimulus dollars. And those of us outside of on the ground work might say, gosh, superintendent, why aren't you using the money to get the right math stuff in place, or to use it for the mental health needs, with the SEL for what your families need in the community, and erroneously pass judgment. Instead, it's, here are the system elements for what these dollars are intended for. So let's use an easy one on health. A superintendent might say, look, I need to use some of these dollars to improve my HVAC systems. I need to gain the trust of my community that this is going to be a safe place for kids before I can even address my instructional needs or the curriculum materials. And working really hard to understand and respect that they are the decision makers, and just provide the information for the rest of the components that are, here is the best information we have about the elements against this 10-point plan for you to be able to make the best decisions possible with the money that you might have available, and approach it that way, rather than, here's the answer, here's what you should do, we don't understand why you're not doing it, why aren't you using curriculum green? It's really weird, it's been around forever and you're not using it. So trying to step back from judgment and really come in as support is what we're trying to accomplish in this COVID recovery stage of the work that we just passed year 1 and going into year 2.
All right, very good. Although, boy, it's hard, Mary Alice. My whole life is about judgment. That's what we do at the Thomas Fordham Institute. We're the gadfly. We like to, and again, but not just to judge, but to be constructive and hopefully push people towards evidence and research. But you're right. If you're not on the local level, you don't understand the context. And I think the HVAC example is a great one, because from afar, we might think to ourselves, what are they talking about? This is going to be spending all this money, and the HVAC thing is going to be not a big deal 6 months from now. But you're right. If that's what it takes to get families comfortable sending their kids back to school, which we know is so important, then that might be a very important investment to make. All right. Well, I first of all, let me just say to everybody watching, please do send in those questions. We're starting to get some, so that's great. Through the Q&A would be excellent. And we'll start getting those into the conversation. All right, but now, so Brian and Jean, Mary Alice just said we shouldn't judge, but let's be a little bit judgy and saying, we've talked a lot about good uses of the federal funds, but let's talk about, are there some things that maybe should be red flags if we see people, at least that are worthy of some questions if we see the money heading in a certain direction? I mean, Brian, you mentioned earlier, and we have a question on this, that there's already a lot of money being spent in some places on interventions. I assume that means like, contracting out to private companies to provide tutoring and things like that. That maybe if more of that money went to the, regular instruction, curriculum, helping teachers teach it well, you wouldn't need as much intervention, right? Are there some other things that we should, be excited about the money going towards, not as excited about? What are your thoughts on that? Why don't you go first, Brian?
Yeah, I think in general, there are 3 buckets of spending that will have, the goals of the money should be to address immediate impacts of the pandemic, particularly on the students who are most impacted by being out of school or by the pandemic itself, and investments that build sustainable systems for longer term change. And in my mind, those fall in 3 categories. The first is buying high quality materials, stuff. This is an opportune time to do that. There's often high initial fixed costs at the front end, and then they tail out for sustain. So that is a nice purchase now. The second would be any investment that builds the capacity of your current staff, because new skills and knowledge that staff learn through professional learning opportunities that are embedded ideally in the core curriculum will sustain past the funding cliff of ESSER funds. And the third is, I do think there will be some acute student support services that are needed. And I think this is an area, perhaps say counselors or mental health professionals, or extended school time that's meaningful, or out of school partnerships. I really think these were pre-pandemic wish list items that we knew mattered and were important. And can the education sector use this opportunity to pick a few of these, 1 or 2 per district, and really go deep and show communities that we can deliver high dose tutoring well, we can provide mental health supports, and it matters. And that means having metrics at the front end now to be able to measure the outcome, to show in 2 years, this is what happened. I'm hearing some superintendents who are thinking, let's try to make a couple of those investments, really track what works, and then we can use all our title money in the future and move it towards that area of what works. Or let's build a case, a proof point that we can do. We really need wraparound services for some of our students. Let's show that that gets results, and then we can make a case for a longer term funding of that.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, the tutoring thing especially, we'll get more into this, but it's really complicated to do this well, because you're trying to, probably the tutoring is not being done by the class teacher. So you got to figure out a way for the tutor and the teacher to be connected, and you want to use the same materials, and you got to figure out your instructional strategies and your data. And it's not as, maybe at first blush, it looks like an easy thing to pull off, and it's not, right? And you're going to need exceptional leadership to manage whatever challenges come up. And that's going to be hard to do at huge scale right out of the box. Hey, Brian, Jim Short at the Carnegie Corporation has a question. He said, if you could talk about the components of effective curriculum-based professional learning needed to support teachers in implementing these high quality instructional materials. Happen to know that Jim Short recently wrote a great report about exactly that. We loved it, Jim. So people should check that out as well. Jim, maybe you can put it in the chat, but tell us about that, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, for that question. And thank you for your report with Stephanie Hirsch. It's entitled The Elements. It looks at what it takes for a system to implement high quality curriculum, particularly around the professional learning demands of teachers. These are things like before a unit of instruction starts, how do you work with teachers to, quote, internalize that unit and understand what is supposed to happen in it, to do collaborative lesson planning together, then to go do observation and feedback with each other about what worked and what could be improved in the lesson. And afterwards, lots of looking at student work and having calibration conversations around what I'm seeing is that what you're seeing, and what is the next step to make sure that each individual student moves forward. These are all these instructionally enabling systems that, to Mary Alice's point, make the curriculum come alive and have the impact, its intended impact in the day-to-day work of the classroom teaching.
Awesome. Fantastic. All right, Gene, what about you? What do you think about good and bad uses of this money?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it from the red flag perspective. So I guess if it's not the green flag, we'll call that the red flag. I wholeheartedly agree with how Brian framed it. Couldn't have said it better myself. I'll introduce a different lens that I think would lead to some of the same conclusions. One of them would be, and Mary Alice alluded to this as well with the HVAC example of prioritizing the human element as one, and prioritizing the sense of agency within the community as another. And what it means that our investments have to prioritize process as much as product. So on that second point around agency, like the example of the HVAC unit is that it's actually not just the superintendent was the decision maker. It's that the superintendent was listening to the community and understanding what creates investment and a sense of shared meaning around what we're doing in our schools. And that's crucial at this point where we've physically been apart from each other. And there are so many ways in which the ability to create trust has been hindered, and in some cases outright ruptured. The other that I would give in this notion of the human element is to double click on what Brian said around the capacity of staff, the professional development attached to curriculum, but also what that means for recognizing that teachers are taxed. We convene districts from across the nation who are thinking about what they're going to do this summer. And the teachers that normally teach summer school don't want to. They want a break. And they're trying to figure out how to rejuvenate and be ready to walk back into a classroom with students that they haven't seen, with gaps that may be different from what they've encountered before, and answering new questions. And so that capacity isn't just about the core curriculum. It's also about the human sustainability and what they need to feel rejuvenated. And it means to answer these questions around the question that what's come up before around the racial reckoning, around the challenges that we're facing nationally. It means districts that have invested in introducing the faculty as a whole to Zaretta Hammond and Gloria Ladson-Billings and Alfred Tatum. Folks are helping us think about what does rich, culturally responsive, equitable practice look like, not just the trappings of superficial, cultural indicators, but the deep research base and cognitive base around culturally responsive learning and bringing the whole child into the classroom. And then the last thing that I would highlight would be just the notion that we want to bring partners into the work as another way to engage both the community and build the capacity. School systems are at a point, as they have been for quite some time, where they have to account for everything, but they weren't built to do everything. The ESSER funds create a few new levers in which, and there's a couple of districts that are thinking really creatively about working with intermediaries to identify partner organizations and also build the capacity of the partners to align their work to the attendance indicators or the academic and core curriculum indicators that we'd like to see growing with the students. And so using the funds to create those new and more robust partnerships is I think, another promising approach we've seen from some districts.
And Jean, there was something about an example from Massachusetts you wanted to bring in at one point. Maybe we passed that.
Oh, no, it wasn't Massachusetts. It was
I saw MA.
It was Mary Alice. When Mary Alice brought up it,
yes. That MA.
State unto herself,
Yes.
but a lot of good stuff.
Yeah. All right. Gotcha. Good. Well, speaking of Mary Alice, a couple of things. First of all, Mary Alice, there's demand out there for the 10-point plan. I don't know if that's something you all will be able to share, or maybe at some point. And then also a great question from James Larimore about whether you've got some examples of a local community that you think has done a good job where there's been support for this local decision making that you're encouraging, maybe with the help of national resources. Can you think of some out there?
There's lots. There's many. I'll give a few examples. So first, yes, I can share the context of the 10-point plan. So let me give you a little bit more of how that got developed. With the Council of Chief State School Officers, so that organization, the Department of Ed, the Biden administration, and NGA. So the executive sponsorship of the governors, the state chiefs, and making sure that the 10 points were aligned with the intended use of the federal dollars. So it is a framework, it's large. We're gonna publish it, so it'll be pretty, but I can send you the context because it's signed off on. The whole thing is built around that. So I'm happy to share, but it's not pretty yet. It'll be published and prettier. So I'll give a couple of examples of what we're trying to do. And this is specific to the work I'm currently leading since COVID response and now COVID recovery. So this was not a direct result of the Gates investment, but in Nebraska, the state chief who's very into curriculum and instructional strategies, decided to use federal dollars to incentivize an LMS system. So learning management system, but it's local control. And so what he did was say, okay, districts, I am going to purchase with state dollars 80% of what it will cost. You need to use 20% of your local dollars if you either want to go to this LMS system, or if it's cheaper for you than what you're currently using, or if you don't have one, here, it's really inexpensive. He's got 87%, 92% of his districts now using a common LMS system. There's an enabling condition, a data management system that's not just about data, it's learning management. So teachers can have access, principals can have access to the learning needs, et cetera. He then took state dollars and said, because of COVID, everybody's online and your adopted curriculum with your textbooks may be cumbersome, printing off things. I am going to purchase Zern as a contract for the state So you only have to pay 10% of your money to use Zern for mathematics. High quality, and it's online for its hybrid. Guess what the districts did? So he now has incentivized the use of the dollars from a policy state level executive opportunity to then have the influence of the local districts to, I would say, go toward pretty substantial long-term transformational change potential for the schools and districts in Nebraska. So that's an example of what we're trying to do with the national coordination of things. That doesn't mean every district did it. He doesn't have 100% yet, but boy, compared to what it was prior to COVID, never let a good crisis go to waste. So locally, I would say it's born and raised in Rhode Island, went to school in Massachusetts, so I love the MA, I'll take it. There's some really interesting work going on in Boston, and some of even local businesses that adopt school districts, relationships with the local, trying to support kids within a specific school that a business lives in. We have with Gates what we call focus states. There's a number of states where we do collaborative investment with others, even on a national scale. We do co-investments with Balmer, with Wallace, with Walton, to try to, if we collaborate on an investment where we see really good stuff happening, again, the role of philanthropy is to either accelerate that, support it going further, support it scaling, even if it's across to another district in the local area. And then the work with that district or the principal of a school to engage a community foundation or a business to support the same work. So I will use my former district in Renton, where we had, our high schools did not have teachers endorsed in mathematics at the high school. I had 3 comprehensive high schools and very few. I won't even give you the numbers because it was unbelievable. And so we did a program in partnership with the university, with the local businesses that actually paid for teachers to get their endorsement in mathematics. It took the teachers time, but not their cost for the tuition of the, got that business support for making that happen. Brought in the universities, had our own staff involved in the and then adopted the curriculum using the financial resources of the district to align to high quality curriculum. So we also got a grant. It wasn't the Gates Foundation, but it was a way to take national or foundational support coupled with local community, local resources, and then the additional resources. So everybody had skin in the game. It wasn't just give me, it was here's what I'm trying to accomplish, and then everybody could latch onto it. And so I think there's thousands of examples of those kinds of things. And part of this national effort with the collaborative of funders is to try to get a map of that, at least at the state and district levels. I don't know that we'll get locally. I think that's going to be really difficult throughout the country, but in specific areas, we'll be able to do that and literally have like a heat map of something like that as part of this next step of the COVID recovery.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks, Mary Alice. Another similar question about what funders can do getting districts to work with partners. Rebecca Goldberg, I think, really liked this idea, Jean, about reaching out to local community partners to collaborate around what to do this summer and beyond. But what might those funders do to incentivize or encourage districts to do that? I guess I'm reading into that maybe there's some places where the districts are a little hesitant to be reaching out to partners on that. What might help from the funder perspective?
Well, I think a couple of things. So we recently brought together district partners, so not districts themselves, but partner organizations, including Mike, you were there, and some districts, to understand, what does it mean for those of us who are around the districts, sort of orbiting the districts and trying to support, to be as supportive as possible at times like this. One of the things that I think we don't have we don't see districts with the capacity to do, just in terms of time and resources, is create learning communities, whether they're localized or organized around like sort of content areas, professional development or curriculum development. And so when we bring districts together, they're saying, well, everybody's knocking on our door because they know we have the dollars right now. And so they all want to bring their thing to help us do their thing in our district. The districts are trying to find time to convene a table that says, let's take a look at our strategic initiatives. Let's take a look at our local data and see what's needed here. And so if we can create the space, and I think funders can play a role here to incentivize different kinds of conversations and ask maybe everybody to take a moment to set aside their normal predispositions of like, we're invested in this thing, and instead say, let's ask the questions around what's happening in this community. And that gets back to what I was saying earlier in terms of, creating a sense of community agency, thinking about investments that are about process as much as they are about product, so that we can make better decisions. Especially because there's so much urgency right now to spend a lot of money. And I've made this joke a few times. It's like the movie Brewster's Millions. Like, it's actually hard to spend this money this quickly. And at the same time, seize the opportunity we have right now to actually seed things that might be transformative. And so if we don't convene some thoughtful conversations with a diverse group of stakeholders and a strong local bent, then we're just going to make short-term investments that might have short-term impact.
Well said. That's what we want to avoid. Hey, this one, maybe this was for Brian, but others can get in this as well. We called our plan the acceleration imperative. We thought we were so clever by using the word acceleration. Well, that word is popping up everywhere. And you see it all the time. People talking about the need for accelerating learning, as opposed, I think what many people are talking about, as opposed to remediation, right? Or going backwards. But like everything in education, this can become just another one of these catchwords that can lose its meaning. So help us understand what is that really supposed to mean, Brian, or why is this important for schools and districts, networks, and now funders to think about this?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. First comment on the topic of acceleration versus remediation is that any of these conversations have to be very content specific, grade level and content specific even. So this is where funders helping districts think through their foundational reading supports, for instance, versus their high school math strategy. The acceleration context looks very different in different grade and different contexts. In short, I often think in math, for instance, this is a perfect place for grade level instruction with just-in-time supports, but that really means that teachers are supported with knowing the content very well, so they know the prerequisite skills for any given lesson or unit on the math side. On the reading side, that often means not swapping out a text, but it means providing more time, more attention, more pre-teaching to the text that is core in the curriculum for the grade level, and providing strategies for accessing that text, which may mean more background knowledge, more vocabulary, repeated readings, but that is something you would do in the reading setting, but not necessarily the math setting. So I think we need to have a more nuanced conversation of what acceleration means in the context of various content subject areas.
All right, fair enough. And is there, again, as sort of people who might be external to these systems as funders, are there certain things that they should be watching for that might indicate that maybe their partners are going in the wrong direction? Maybe they're doing too much remediation that's not actually giving kids what they need?
Yeah, a couple of red flags that I would say. One are tracking programs that are putting students in various locked tracks. Second would be too much pull out of core instructional time instead of a push-in support or additional support. And then finally, to Jean's point, I just think the more we can think about the process of having these conversations with teachers, with students. I mean, anyone who went through the year just has so much to unpack, to make meaning of what happened, to reconnect. It is Teacher Appreciation Week this week, and like just the experience that teachers went through, they have to be integral as students that do themselves to the solutions going forward. So I think any funder that just slaps the initiative or the strategy on to a system is not the approach we want to take here.
That's such a great way to end. Let me, first of all, thank this fantastic panel, Brian, Jean, Mary Alice. Really appreciate your time and insights. And I asked you some tough follow-up questions and you didn't flinch. Appreciate you really getting specific and concrete. Mary Alice, the people want the 10-point plan. They're desperate for it. So we'll be looking for that. We know the pretty version's not ready yet, but let me turn it back over to Celine.
Yes, thanks, Mike. And yes, Mary Alice, this is as close as I've ever seen to a riot in our chat box. But I thought this was a great session. I know that I'm going to reference it in the next 15 conversations I have with other funders who weren't able to make it today. So thank you. So specific, so necessary at this moment. So I really just want to offer my thanks. Want to flag for you. I think we have a slide, Jesse. I know people are starting to log off, but we have some great programming coming up, including meet our new Chief Program Officer. Nora Flood from the Wendt Collective is going to interview her. And then we have our second in this series on resource equity coming up on May 18th. So please join us, and really, really great to have you all today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks, everybody.